So let's take a look at the spinal cord. The spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum, so just inferior to the brainstem, and continues down to about L1 to L2, the first or second lumbar vertebrae. There are a couple of enlargements. There's an enlargement in the cervical spine, of course, called the cervical enlargement, and there's one in the lumbar spine called the lumbar enlargement. The spinal cord is thicker in these areas because of the number of nerves and neurons needed to innervate the upper extremities for the cervical enlargement and the lower extremities for the lumbar enlargement. The spinal cord ends in a cone-shaped process called the medullary cone or conus medullaris. On the inferior end of the spinal cord, like I said, we had the conus medullaris, but then we also have all the nerves coming out, and together this is called the cauda equina. The cauda equina, or horse's tail. There's also a ligament that anchors the inferior end of the spinal cord called the filum terminale. If we look at a transverse section of the spinal cord, we see that the outer portion of the spinal cord here consists of white matter, and you might remember that white matter is myelinated, and that surrounds a core of gray matter, and gray matter, of course, is unmyelinated. The white matter is typically white matter axons. There are also two nerve roots that exit, one in the back, the posterior or dorsal nerve root, and one in the front, anterior or the ventral nerve root. So the white matter then, the white matter sections are divided. Well, let's look at some other structures. We have the central, or the gray commissure, which unites the two halves of the spinal cord, and the central canal right in the middle. That contains cerebral spinal fluid. We also have the anterior median fissure, this one right here, and the posterior median sulcus right here. So the white matter is divided into what are called funiculi. So let's take a look at that. Here we go. Okay, so we have funiculi. So here we have the posterior funiculus, which is this area through here. This is all white matter, so that's the posterior funiculus. So posterior funiculus. And then this area through here is the lateral funiculus. So the lateral funiculus. And then this area in here is the anterior funiculus. Alright, so that's the white matter. The gray matter is divided into horns. So we have, let's do it on this side, this is the anterior horn, anterior horn. This one, of course, is the posterior horn. That's the posterior horn. Okay, and then there's a bump. Usually there's a bump in here called the lateral horn. Right? And then, as I said before, we have the dorsal root and the ventral root. On the dorsal root is this bump here. This is called the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. In the dorsal root ganglion, a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies. So the cell bodies for the neurons in the dorsal root reside in the dorsal root ganglion. The cell bodies for the ventral root reside in the anterior horn. Right, there's a photo of our actual spinal cord model, and so you can see this is posterior, you see the bony walls of the spine, and then you see right in here we have the meninges, we have the coverings, the meninges. So right here we would have, this is called the dura mater. On the inside of this layer, on the inside right here, is another layer. This is called the arachnoid mater. And against the spinal cord itself, this layer right through here, this is called the pia mater. Now between the arachnoid and the pia mater, right here, this is called the subarachnoid space. And that contains cerebral spinal fluid. So this is the back. Here's our dorsal root ganglion right in through here. Here's our dorsal root and our ventral root. There's also a space here between the dura mater and the bony walls of the spine called the epidural space. All right. Functions of the spinal cord. The spinal cord can relay impulses between the sensory system and the brain. So it moves information up and down, sensory information to the brain, motor information from the brain to effectors, which are muscles, organs, or glands. It also is a center for spinal reflexes. The reflexes occur in the spinal cord. So we're going to look at a reflex here. This is a monosynaptic reflex. And so we have a muscle right here. So here's our muscle. This is our muscle right here. So the muscle. And the muscle has a sensory receptor on it. This thing right here, a sensory receptor. This is typically called the muscle spindle. Muscle spindle senses stretch. So the muscle spindle senses stretch. It conveys the impulses toward the central nervous system via a sensory neuron, or afferent, sensory afferent neuron. And that neuron moves through the dorsal root and synapses with, and it can make one synapse with, or connection with, a motor neuron, an efferent neuron, motor neuron, right here. This goes to the muscle. So how does this work? Well, you tap the tendon with a little hammer, reflex hammer. Tap the tendon, and that creates a temporary stretch in the muscle. The muscle spindle senses that change in length, or the stretch of the muscle, and conveys the impulse via the afferent neuron to the spinal cord. It makes a synapse in the anterior horn with a motor neuron, which brings the information to the muscle to tell it to contract. And then the limb jerks, or the limb moves. So that's what's called a monosynaptic reflex. There are some other reflexes that are a little more complex. There's the withdrawal reflex, and that occurs because of interneurons. So there are more neurons involved, and what happens then is that, like say the main example here would be like touching a hot stove. If you touch the stove, the flexors in that limb will contract reflexively and pull the limb away. And then the extensors are inhibited to allow for really fast action to withdraw. There's another reflex that's a little more complex called the crossed extensor reflex. So what happens there, it's like the withdrawal reflex where the flexors will contract rapidly on the ipsilateral side, but on the contralateral side, the extensors contract. So that causes you to further withdraw from the reflex. The other thing about reflexes is that there is actually some input from the brain. So there is some brain input here into the reflex. And so the brain's input is to inhibit the reflex. So the brain will inhibit the reflex. So that means that when you elicit a reflex, when you do a reflex, the reflex looks normal because the brain is doing its job inhibiting it. So if you do like a knee-jerk reflex, you tap the patellar tendon and the limb jerks. It looks normal because the brain is inhibiting it. So that means then if there's a problem with this pathway between the brain and the spinal cord, the reflex will look exaggerated. So in problems like strokes or brain tumors, reflexes will look exaggerated. If there's a problem between this pathway, between the spinal cord and the muscle, the reflex looks diminished or absent. And we see this usually in cases of like a disc injury in the spinal spinal disc injury, peripheral neuropathy, where there's a demyelination occurring in the neurons. And so the reflex, you compare the reflex bilaterally, and one side will be diminished or absent. Right, lastly, there are what are called spinal cord tracts. So spinal cord tracts then occur in the white matter. So you remember this? In the white matter, we have areas of the white matter that carry impulses of a certain nature, and these are called spinal cord tracts. So I'll just give you some real basic information here regarding spinal cord tracts. And there are two kinds. There are what are called ascending tracts. Ascending tracts are sensory, and they carry all sorts of sensory information like pain, temperature, touch, and pressure. And then there are descending tracts, which are motor tracts. Motor tracts. So they carry motor information, and both of these occur in the white matter of the spinal cord. Alright, so we would have both ascending and descending tracts located in these areas. And so some examples of tracts are the spinal thalamic, which is an ascending tract carrying information regarding pain and temperature. There's the cortical spinal tracts, which are motor tracts carrying information to the muscles. Alright, so that's all we're going to do for this lecture.